we're going to continue with the tale Dark and Grim. The last time we read, Hansel and Gretel have those two ox carts and they're heading back to the castle, and the king and queen have been made aware that they're coming, and there we are. When the ox carts were only 100 feet from the gate, Hansel and Gretel got down. Their mother and father ran towards them, arms outstretched. Hansel and Gretel stood and watched them come. They did not reach out their arms, but when their parents reached them, they allowed themselves to be lifted up and held. "I'm so sorry," was the first thing the father said. "I'm so sorry," was the first thing their mother said. And they kissed their children's cheek and wet them with tears and held them tight. They told the servants to care for the oxen and put the canvas-covered carts in the royal stables. And then they brought Hansel and Gretel into the castle where they washed them and fed them. At last, the whole family sat before a glowing hearth in the private wing of the castle. The shadow of flames danced on their faces. "Tell us everything," the queen said, her face beaming. "Where have you been? What have you done? How did you find your way home?" Hansel and Gretel looked at their parents and then at each other, and they just shrugged. Then they looked at the thick red rug on the floor. It will happen to you, dear reader, at some point in your life. You will face a moment very much like the one like Hansel and Gretel are facing right now. In this moment, you will look at your parents and realize that no matter what it sounds like they are saying, they're actually asking you for forgiveness. It's a very painful moment, you see. All of your life, you've been asking for forgiveness from them. From the age you could talk, you're apologizing for breaking things, forgetting things, hitting things, locking so-and-so in the garage. So having them ask you for forgiveness probably sounds pretty good. But when the moment comes, you'll probably be in a lot of pain, and you'll probably not want to forgive them. In which case, you might ask yourself, what should you do? Well, you could yell at them and tell them all about the ways they've hurt you. This is a good thing to do once because, believe me, they need to know. But this is the first step on the road to forgiveness. What if you're not ready for that? You could pretend to forgive them. This one we do not recommend. It's sort of like sweeping broken glass under the carpet. The floor still isn't clean, and somebody's going to end up with a bloody sock. Finally, if you don't want to forgive them and you don't want to fake it, you can always go on with old, reliable, changing the subject. After a moment, Hansel said, "Tell us about the dragon." And Gretel said, "Yes, tell us about that." The king and queen exchanged an anxious look. Their children, they were still children, were they not, seemed different from the little ones they had frolicked at the foot of their bed on the very day they'd been lost. These two were so serious, so silent, so distant. But the king and queen agreed with merely a look, as only parents can. It is best to give them their time and their space. And so they told Hansel and Gretel all about the dragon. After the children had disappeared, the king explained he had gone out every day to look for them. At first he had taken hunting parties with him, but soon he had become so distraught that he insisted on going out alone. He described pushing through the wet leaves of early spring, persevering through the hailstorms of March and the thunderstorms of April to find them. But he never turned up a single trace of them, and it was one of these days when he was far from the castle that the dragon had come. It began by circling the sky, the queen said. The villagers below ran in panic every which way, unsure where to go or what to do. When the dragon dove the first time, it screamed, and it was said the village 2 miles away heard it. At the end of the first day, one town was utterly gone, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people were dead. Hansel said, "What does it look like?" And the queen shuddered. "It's hideous. Smooth black skin like a snake, eyes that are golden with no whites or pupils at all. Its wings are so thin you can see through them, and each of its talons and teeth look like long, sharp obsidian shards." When the king came home that first night and saw that had happened, he assembled an army, and they rode out to meet the beast, but they could not find it. Every day for a week they rode around looking for the dragon, but never would it show its face. Then, one day, the army was under the direction of the captain of the guard, for the king had been taken ill. That day, the king said bitterly, the dragon had come and destroyed the army completely. Now there were few soldiers left in the kingdom, and fewer still who would face the dragon. There had been nothing anyone could do for a long time now, except watch the dragon tear the kingdom apart. Gretel's brow furrowed. "Well," she said at last, "Hansel and I will come up with something."
You got a call from...
Okay, I'm recording something. Thanks, Atticus.
Sorry.
It's okay. Atticus. The king and queen smiled at her as she were a very little child, and then they smiled at each other. "That's very brave of you," the queen said gently. "But what We're just happy to have you home. We don't need you to worry yourself about the dragon, dear. And Gretel stood up. Her eyes were almost level with those of her seated parents. Almost. Has either of you ever cut off your own finger? She asked. They stared at her. She raised her left hand to show them, and they gasped. No. What about killing people? How many people have you killed? Killed? The father said. Yes. Besides me and Hansel, she said. Ha ha ha. Yes. The father's face grew red, his voice quiet. None, honey. Why? We have 2, Gretel said, and Hansel stood up beside her. Has either of you been to hell? He asked. What? The parents cried. Been tortured by demons, Hansel asked. They shook their heads and stared at the children. He gave them one last chance. Has the devil's head ever rested in your lap? And neither replied. Then I think you better leave this to us, Gretel said, and the 2 children went back to the room to talk things over. An hour later they returned. So, Hansel said, dragons love treasure, right? At least in storybooks, Gretel added. The parents looked at each other and shrugged. I guess, the king replied. Okay, let's say they do, Hansel said. We have a cartload of golden apples in the stable right now. His mother's eyes grew wide. You do? How on earth did you get that? The king asked. We'll explain later, Gretel said impatiently. Are you listening? The king and queen nodded sheepishly. Okay, so we take the cart of apples out to the clearing in the forest, Hansel said. We open it up, Gretel cut in, so the dragon can see it. Hopefully, he'll be attracted to the gold. We'll have to raise an army. They'll be hiding the trees all around, Hansel said, with bows and arrows, and swords and axes. And when the dragon is distracted by the apples, the archers will fire at it from the cover of the tree. It won't know where the arrows are coming from. It'll be confused and hopefully wounded. And that's when everyone else will run out and attack it, Gretel concluded. Suddenly the queen began to nod. That's not a bad plan, she said, turning to the king. Well, the king tried to find some fault or other because that's what fathers do. Raising an army, that will be difficult. Our people don't want to fight anymore. They're afraid. We have to try, Hansel said. It may not work, Gretel agreed, but it's better than doing nothing. After a few more perfunctory objections, their father finally had to admit that indeed it sounded like a pretty good plan. The queen, blushing a little, said, Do you need all the apples for the plan? If so, I understand, of course. I just was wondering, The king smiled. Your mother would like an apple, he said. She's always had a passion for gold. That's how we met, you know. I heard, said Gretel. You stole her. I did not, the king said. Admit it, darling, the queen laughed. You sort of did. You stole mother? Hansel asked. Well, yes, I suppose I sort of did, said the father. The king laughed at himself, and the queen laughed some more, and Hansel and Gretel began to smile. It was the first crack in their armor their parents had yet seen, and the king and the queen laughed and tearfully reached out their arms to the children. But with that, the children's smiles died away, and after a moment the king and queen lowered their heads, and Gretel whispered, We have to go to bed now. It is late, and we have a lot to do tomorrow. Hansel stood without moving for a moment. Then he said, Yes, that is true. And the 2 children turned away from their parents and went upstairs to bed. It feels like something is pressing down on my chest, Gretel said, lying in bed that night, her eyes wide open. Something heavy and sharp and painful. I felt it for a long, long time now. Since we left, Hansel said, nodding in the darkness. Since just before we left, Gretel corrected him. There was silence, and she said, It's been getting worse recently. It's never been so bad as it right now. I feel like I can hardly breathe. I know, said Hansel. I just want to take it off and throw it off of me, make someone else feel it and hold it and carry it for a while. The bed creaked and settled beneath them. They had been empty for a long time, and at last Hansel said, Not just someone, he said. No, Gretel agreed. I don't want just someone to take this burden from me.